In this video, we're going to have a look at who Jesus was, how we interpret who he was, what sort of Jesus we end up with. I'm going to approach this by looking at the views of Dominic Crossan and N.T. Wright. They arrive at their conclusions from different starting premises, and as we engage with that, we'll have a look at different ways that you can understand the New Testament, particularly the Gospels, being put together, and how we then are able to use the information in the Gospels to shape our understanding of Jesus. There's a particular focus in the video on the Educas A-Level RS Christianity paper, and in that syllabus this is section F, called Two Views of Jesus. So it is these two scholars that we'd be going to focus on, use this as a way into this question. And we've got Dominic Crossan, and he sees Jesus as a social revolutionary. Major issue is he uses what are known as the apocryphal Gospels, and we'll have a look at that later. And he sees Jesus very much as a product of his time, and he looks at what the words of Jesus would have meant in Jesus' time. Then we'll look at N.T. Wright and the idea that Jesus was the true Messiah, so the Messiah is understood within a Jewish context. And we're going to look at Wright's concept of critical realism and look at how worldviews shape our interpretation. This also links into the idea of the Bible being the inspired word of God. There's another video looking at the Bible, what it means to say that the Bible is revelation. And also it will look at how the canon was put together, how that collection of books we now have in the Bible is there, and looking at the use of what are known as apocryphal Gospels, the ones that are not included in the canon. I want to start this by looking at this idea of axioms. Now, axioms are the initial faith commitments. They're the starting points of any argument at all. They're always present, whether you're a scientist, whether you're a theologian, whatever it is you're doing, you must be working from axioms, those things which you simply are going to take as unargued, your starting points. They're very rarely stated in any scholar's work, but they are going to profoundly shape everything that we do. The most important element of this is to understand there's no such thing as a neutral position. There is no axiom-free position, and whenever you're reading anything at all, it's always worth asking yourself the question, what are the axioms, what are the foundational assumptions that this piece is written from? If you understand the axioms, then it can explain a lot of what people are saying. So it's a fairly obvious example relevant to this. If your starting position, an axiom, is that God is the ultimate source of all that there is, God created and sustains the universe, you can end up with a completely different understanding of the world and evaluation of any data that you see if your starting point is we live in a closed universe of natural order with God, that's if there is a God at all, completely separate from this system. Looking at the importance of axioms in our study of Jesus, if we have an axiom which says God is the ultimate source of all that is, God created and sustains the universe, therefore miracles can happen. Therefore reports in the New Testament may be authentic, therefore the Gospels may be understood as essentially historical. And so you could see that presented in a line of argument. Might have somebody else comes up with axiom 2, and they say we live in a closed universe of natural order with God, if there is a God, completely separate from the universe. Therefore, miracles cannot happen. Therefore, the reports in the New Testament must be fabrications, and therefore the Gospels are not historical. But very importantly, if you have a look at those first statements, there's a therefore in front of them, but those actually are not conclusions. That therefore is not legitimate, really, because you've got the axiom which generates them. Essentially, therefore miracles can happen, or therefore miracles cannot happen, is doing little more, if anything, than just simply restate the axioms. But it's very common to ignore the axioms and then present them as if they are the conclusions of an argument. So as we look at this and think about the axioms, as you're reading anything, as you're listening to anybody speak, as you engage with any sort of scholarship, it's very important that you identify whether you've got here conclusions from data, or whether in fact what you've got is ensuring there will be certain conclusions because only certain data is being considered, or whether what you've got is actually it's a rewording of an axiom but presented as if it's the conclusion of an argument. Now, the overall position that you end up with after putting all your axioms together is known as a worldview. Everyone has a worldview. It's not possible to live a normal human life without one. Most people have no idea what it is. It's a bit like the fish swimming in the water. They can't see the water. Our worldview is the water, the intellectual water that we swim in. If I look at this Enlightenment worldview, it became dominant in the 18th century, profoundly significant within modern Western academia. So it's had a huge impact on almost certainly whoever's listening to this video. It will have had a huge impact on your own worldview. And a key element in this is the idea that there are things called facts which somehow exist and are there to be found, and the idea that a fact is simply a fact. The same fact is just accessible in exactly the same way to all observers. This way of thinking is then presented as if this is being scientific. An underlying assumption here is that people are somehow able to gain this view from nowhere, what's sometimes called a monarchical vision or a God's eye view, that somehow we're able to step outside the world and view it from this completely neutral position with no biases to achieve a totally objective view, as if somehow we've taken whatever it is that we're looking at into some sort of intellectual clean room and we are seeing pure, unadulterated facts. Now, this position is the extreme objective position. In other words, it is completely unrelated to the human observer. Now, a response to that Enlightenment model is what's known as the postmodern. So that Enlightenment model would normally be referred to as modernist. And so what comes after it and responds to it is postmodern. And almost certainly the listener to this video has been influenced by postmodernism. If you're under 30, then you have lived in an environment, you've been brought up in an environment, the media you've engaged with is just absolutely soaked in postmodernism, and so therefore are you. There's so various strands within postmodernism. Some you've probably heard of: intersectionality, critical theory, and this sees people from different positions having a radically different perception of the world and with almost no ability to share knowledge. So looking at that intersectionality idea, you get somebody who's a black, disabled lesbian, and they have access to knowledge which is simply not available to a white, able-bodied man. And that particular line of thinking treats the former as superior. Now, this is the extreme subjective. In other words, it's totally rooted in the observer, to the extent that actually, if you push this to its logical conclusion, it means that every single individual has their own unshareable view and experience of the world. Another response to this Enlightenment worldview, this modernist position, is known as critical realism. We're going to look at this with N.T. Wright as an example. Now, critical realism accepts that there is truth and there are facts to be discovered. So in that way, it agrees with that modernist Enlightenment position. But critical realism also sees an important role for the observer, the acceptance of some of the postmodern insights that you simply can't get outside the system, that if you are observing, you are part of the system being observed, you therefore are part in some way, part of any truth or facts that you are observing. Now, we must be aware of these worldview issues in our exploration of the biblical texts and examination of scholars who are working with them. A great example of this impact of worldview and axioms is the biblical theologian, great scholar of the mid-20th century, really, Rudolf Bultmann, German theologian, hugely influential man. And his axiom, wonderfully stated, so he's actually stated his axiom, we know exactly where he's coming from. And there's this very famous bit of his when he says, written in German of course, but I'm going to read this in English, we cannot use electric lights and radios and, in the event of illness, avail ourselves of modern medical and clinical means, and at the same time believe in the spirit and wonder world of the New Testament. Now that's his starting point, that's his axiom. And of course, Bultmann therefore rejects the miraculous. In actual fact, he looks at almost the irrelevance of it and the irrelevance of the historical Jesus. But again, that's another video. That's if you want that one, that's about the kerygma. But as we look at this axiom, it's worth not just engaging with Bultmann's theology that he builds from it, but questioning his axiom. Well, let's just do a very simple observation of contemporary society. Way more scientifically and technologically advanced than 1940s Germany when he was putting his ideas together. And it clearly shows, as we observe people, this statement's untrue. We're now in the 21st century, and there's absolutely no shortage of people at all who believe in this spirit and wonder world of the New Testament. The people who read horoscopes, they believe in ghosts, they have absolutely no problem with lots of rather woo-woo stuff that your hard-nosed scientific materialist modernist will completely reject. And so that's going into the axiom and looking at whether that is valid. Now, of course, if the axiom falls down, you can be pretty sure that plenty that's built on it will also fall down. So always be careful to think about what the axioms are that any argument is built on. One of the scholars that we're going to have a look at is N.T. Wright. He's a contemporary theologian and prolific on YouTube, so he's easy to find material from him. A great communicator and also written loads and loads of books. Wright is coming out of a sort of mainstream Christian conservative traditionalist sort of end of the spectrum. He's a New Testament scholar, Pauline theologian. In terms of his church, he's a Church of England Anglican bishop. He was in fact Bishop of Durham, and he's a top academic, and he's currently got this post of a senior research fellow at Wycliffe Hall, which is at Oxford. Wright presents a defence of a traditional understanding of Jesus. He's working with Jesus in the Jewish context. His axioms allow him to accept the potential historicity of miracles. And we're particularly going to look at Wright with this idea of critical realism. So his method of historical research means that he rejects that modernist view, the view from nowhere, the monarchical vision, as if you're standing in this sort of God position, completely outside of everything. You don't have any influence on anything, any engagement with it, and you just have this completely unmediated, pure access to data. And what we're particularly interested in is historical data. So he rejects that, but he's also not going to go down the postmodern route of saying everything is entirely subjective. And so it's this balance between the subjective, our engagement, our lens that we look at, our perception of it, but also an acceptance that what we are perceiving is something that is actually there and has some reality to it. So Wright then rejects the false choice, a false dichotomy, he says, between subjectivity, the postmodern, and this really hard-nosed objectivity that the modernists often thought of as scientific, the way they approach things. And so what critical realism does is says that we must understand the process of our own thinking. So we are part of that process of data collection, our thinking. We aren't neutral observers. In other words, worldview precedes facts. We can only see facts because of the lens through which we are viewing the world, and the lens there, that is an image for our worldview. So our worldview highlights certain things we call facts. Worldview enables us to see certain things which we call facts. So critical realism is really interested in the role of the observer in creating and then interpreting ideas, rejecting the idea that they're just neutral, that these facts just exist out there in some pure form. And although both science and theology are about the pursuit of truth, and Wright certainly thinks there is something called truth, he thinks there are facts as well, but also the acknowledgement that these are not just there and completely obvious. It takes some work to get at them, and there's a certain amount of you've got to be a bit tentative as you engage with what you're going to call truth and these facts, but without rejecting them. Let's read then this quote from Wright, which sums this up. I propose a form of critical realism. This is a way of describing the process of knowing that acknowledges the reality of the thing known as something other than the knower, hence realism, while fully acknowledging that the only access we have to this reality lies along the spiralling path of appropriate dialogue or conversation between the knower and the thing known, hence critical. Now what we're doing here is epistemology. Welcome to one of the quite complicated areas of philosophy. Epistemology is a major theme within contemporary philosophy, and it's the theory of knowledge. In other words, how can we know what we think we know? What does knowledge mean? What does it mean to know something? How can we know it? What confidence, if any, can we have in that which we say we are knowing? It's a major and foundational area of philosophy, and for those who are approaching this in terms of it being RS A level, it's very important to understand that there's no epistemology within that syllabus, so you have to be aware that you're pretty ignorant about this major area within philosophy. I know what that means is you need to be very cautious about any statements that you make about what you know and what can be known. The next scholar we're going to look at is John Dominic Crossan. Again, contemporary, a bit older than N.T. Wright, but is still around and still functioning. Now, Crossan is far more difficult to place, far more complex and nuanced, and needs great care if you're using Crossan's work. Crossan is Irish-American. He's a New Testament scholar, very well-respected historian of early Christianity. His focus is on that historical Jesus, trying to get into the period when Jesus was living. So Crossan is a well-recognised expert in that whole cultural anthropology of the ancient Mediterranean, where the New Testament world is. The other aspect of Crossan is not quite so mainstream and highly respected, which is why when using Crossan you need great care. Crossan is a former Catholic priest. I don't actually know why he left the Catholic Church, but the chances are he left with some baggage, so that's worth holding in your mind as you engage with Crossan. He's also a prominent member of what's known as the Jesus Seminar. Now, to say the least, this organisation has a well outside the mainstream understanding of who Jesus was. And you might find that there's plenty of disagreements between the sort of liberal and conservative traditions in biblical studies, but they can be fairly united when they're saying that they think the Jesus Seminar is a bit off the mark. As we look then at Crossan's approach, what we see is Crossan presenting Jesus as a social revolutionary, and he draws on contemporary Jewish authors like Josephus. He sees Palestine at the time of Jesus being in a period of social turmoil and protest, and Jesus is depicted and can be understood as a social and political reformer. Crossan sees Jesus very much as a product of his time, set in that Mediterranean world, Jewish context. And what Crossan works on is interpreting the words of Jesus in terms of what it would have meant to those people living in that time. And then number 4, this is very important, Crossan uses apocryphal gospels as a major component in his arguments. Now it's that number 4 in this list which singles Crossan out from pretty well any other scholars. So that first 3, there's quite wide agreement on those. N.T. Wright isn't going to disagree too much with any of that analysis. So the sort of liberal, atheist scholars, there's plenty of New Testament scholars who are coming from an atheist position. Liberal, atheist, traditionalists would all have broad agreement on lots of things, but they would all disagree with number 4 and think that Crossan is actually in error in his use of these apocryphal gospels. And this is where this video crosses over with the idea of the formation of the biblical canon, which I'm not going to deal with here in any detail. Crossan rejects the use of any sources after 60 AD for understanding the historical Jesus, and Crossan also has what I think would be fairly well described as some fairly quirky dating of those biblical texts. So we're looking here New Testament, and particularly at the Gospels, so the ones in the canon, Matthew, Mark, Luke and John. Crossan doesn't use those. What Crossan uses is these other sources, and Crossan's dating gives the Gospel of Thomas, puts that in the 50s. There's a hypothetical document which is known as Q, and Crossan dates that as he dates that earlier than 60, and then he's got a portion of what's known as the Gospel of Peter, which he calls the Cross Gospel, and Crossan dates that as before 60. So that's Crossan's dating, and that is central to his work. It's important to look at the dating that Crossan uses in contrast to what I'm calling standard scholarship. Now, this standard scholarship isn't just all these sort of conservative traditionalist scholars like N.T. Wright. The standard scholarship would include traditionalists, liberals, and even atheist, non-Christian at all, who are engaging with biblical studies and with the dating of the canon. So Crossan then puts the Gospel of Thomas somewhere in the 50s AD. Standard scholarship puts the Gospel of Thomas as early mid 2nd century. So, best part of 100 years later. This hypothetical Q document, earlier than 60, now that matches standard scholarship. It is important to remember that Q is hypothetical. There's no evidence for its existence, other than it looks as if it's a shared source used by Luke and Matthew. Now, if it does exist, it would be earlier than 60, so Crossan is completely in line with everybody else who thinks that Q was actually a document. Then there's this Gospel of Peter. Crossan calls this the Cross Gospel, and Crossan puts it earlier than 60. Standard scholarship again puts this early mid 2nd century, so a good sort of 70 or 80 years later than Crossan wants to work with. Now, what Crossan's dating enables him to do is to eliminate the canonical Gospels from his consideration. If you remember, he doesn't want to work with anything later than the 60s, so he puts those apocryphal Gospels rather quirkily very early compared to standard scholarship. But he also, alongside that, he pushes the canonical Gospels right to the extreme upper limit of their standard dating range. Standard scholarship gives anything up to 20-year range for the writing of the Gospels, and Crossan chooses the highest date for those. So as far as Crossan's concerned, we've got the Gospel of Mark at late 70s, then that's followed by Matthew. He's got Luke in the 90s, and then he's pushed the Gospel of John into the 2nd century. So he can now reject all those because he has said that nothing after the 60s is of any value in terms of getting at the historical Jesus. Let's have a look then at Crossan's Axioms. So here's a Crossan quote. "I presume that Jesus, who did not and could not cure that disease or any other one, healed the poor man's illness by refusing to accept the disease, ritual uncleanliness, and social ostracization." Now, the crucial bit of that is when Crossan is saying not only did not heal, but could not. Now, N.T. Wright might be looking at a description of something Jesus did and say, I don't actually think that Jesus did that, but he would not be one who would be ruling out the cure by Jesus. So what we've got here is Crossan stating his axioms. He's rejecting any possibility that Jesus could heal people using, for want of a better term, supernatural means. So the conclusion that Jesus could and did at times genuinely produce real cures from illness is not dependent on using a traditional interpretation of the Bible. It's about the starting axioms. If your starting axiom allows the possibility that Jesus could do that, you then look at the evidence and decide if that looks credible. But if your axiom rules that out from the start, you're clearly going to look at those traditional interpretations of the Bible and say, well, no, you've got to come up with something different other than it's a straight piece of historical recording. Crossan puts great emphasis on understanding Jesus as a social revolutionary. He's looking at the Jewish living in the Roman Empire context of the life of Jesus. However, there's not much within Crossan's historical analysis which can't be incorporated within a pretty mainstream traditional Christian understanding supported by N.T. Wright. This is why Crossan is quite a difficult scholar to work with. He's very well respected across pretty well all traditions as a historian. His social analysis, his social history of the time is second to none. The bit that's rejected then, which can be separated from his basic historical analysis, is his use of these apocryphal gospels. As we look then at Jesus as social revolutionary, Crossan focuses on Jesus intending, he wants to be a social revolutionary, have a social revolution. He sees Jesus started off with John the Baptist in the desert and as an ascetic, but then moved out into mainstream society, advocated a kingdom lifestyle. So in other words, it was moving away from God's future kingdom, that apocalyptic idea, just down to how you're living now, embedded within your family, your friends, your work. Part of that is Jesus served at open table. Food laws are very complex in many cultures. Mainstream Western society doesn't really have any, but certainly the Jewish culture got all those food laws, cleansing rituals and that sort of thing. Jesus just ignored all those. He would eat with anybody, and he presumably eat anything that was served up for him. A very radical approach. Then when it comes to miracles, Crossan has to say that Jesus performed miracles of social healing. He can't have Jesus performing what might be called sort of supernatural miracles of healing, because that's excluded from his worldview. So Crossan sees these miracles as social healing. Jesus practiced an itinerant lifestyle. He certainly did. He wandered around teaching, mainly in the north, occasional forays down into the south to Jerusalem. The last, of course, famously was when he arrived on the donkey, triumphal entry, and then took his social revolution right to the heart of the Jewish establishment, with all the power of those political religious figures in the temple. And surprisingly, he lasted about a week from his arrival to his execution at that point. Crossan also sees Jesus as comparable to the cynics, and that again is Crossan being just a little bit quirky. And those others in the list, pretty mainstream in terms of understanding Jesus, and particularly those who want to take a demythologizing approach and remove all supernatural elements. As we summarise this and look at these two scholars, N.T. Wright is just a completely straightforward traditionalist, open to the possibility of miracles, and therefore just looks at the accounts of Jesus presented in the Gospels to decide if that looks like appropriate historical evidence for saying, yes, that miracle happened. So just fairly straightforward interpreting N.T. Wright. Crossan, a far more complicated character, because you've got one element of Crossan, which is this very highly respected historical analysis of the culture of the time and placing Jesus well and truly within that. But then you've got Crossan's really quite quirky, way outside where pretty well anybody else is, in his rejection of the canonical Gospels, Matthew, Mark and Luke, and his focus on the apocryphal.